It begins with fire. Not the warm glow of a hearth, but the crackle of a funeral pyre stretching toward the Russian sky in 922 AD. A Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan stood among the crowd of Vikings, scribbling down what his eyes could hardly bear to see. He had been sent as a man of faith and diplomacy, but what he witnessed that day was neither holy nor human. A chieftain had died, and his people were preparing him for the afterlife. Yet this was no solemn farewell. It was theater, violent, intimate, and grotesque. A young slave girl had been chosen, or perhaps forced, to accompany her master into death. For days, she was paraded before the tribe, given alcohol, and subjected to acts she believed would carry her spirit to Valhalla alongside her lord. To the Vikings, she was not a person. She was a vessel, a bridge between the living and the dead. On the final day, the tribe gathered around the ship where the chieftain's body lay. The girl was led forward, her trembling hidden beneath layers of ritual. 6 men entered the chamber. Ibn Fadlan does not flinch in his account. Each one violated her as the crowd outside roared with chants. But what came next was even more chilling. An old woman, the so-called Angel of Death, wrapped a cord around the girl's neck. As she pulled tight, another drove a blade into her ribs. Her body collapsed beside her master. Moments later, the ship was set ablaze. Flames consumed flesh, bone, and innocence, carrying them all into the smoke-filled sky. Ibn Fadlan would later confess that the scene haunted him for the rest of his life. And yet, what horrified him most was not the brutality itself. It was the orderliness of it all. Every act was calculated, rehearsed, sanctified. This was not madness. It was culture. A system of belief that fused sexuality, violence, and faith into a single unbreakable weapon. To dismiss this as barbarism would be a mistake. Because for the Vikings, domination was not merely a byproduct of conquest, it was a language, a law, and a legacy. The spectacle Ibn Fadlan recorded was only one chapter in a much larger book of horrors. Beneath the blood and the fire lay a society where power was measured not just in battle, but in the bedroom, where masculinity was sharpened like a blade, and submission could destroy a man's life as surely as an axe to the skull. What Ibn Fadlan saw was not the exception. It was the rule. And to understand the Vikings, we must step deeper into that rule, a world where sex was war, honor was fragile, and the fire never stopped burning. If the pyre was the stage of Viking power, the law was its script. Few societies have ever tied sexuality so tightly to honor, violence, and survival. For the Vikings, intimacy was not private, it was political. It determined whether you stood tall as a free man, or sank into the mud as an outcast. Their sagas reveal a chilling truth. A single insult could unleash more bloodshed than a raid. To be called Arger or Ragger, words meaning unmanly, submissive, or sexually passive, was not mere name-calling. It was a death sentence. Viking law was explicit. Accuse a man of being womanlike in bed, and he had the right to kill you on the spot. No trial. No penalty. Insults about masculinity were considered worse than theft, worse than assault, worse than blasphemy. Why? Because to the Vikings, the role you played in sex determined your role in society. The man who penetrated was dominant, masculine, worthy of land, weapons, and testimony in court. But the man accused of being passive lost everything. His honor collapsed. His rights vanished. He could be stripped of property, silenced in trials, even barred from carrying a sword. In a culture built on raids, violence, and reputation, such humiliation was social death. The sagas tell us of men who traveled hundreds of miles to kill those who mocked their masculinity. Feuds burned across families because one man called another soft. In Egil's saga, warriors spilled rivers of blood to erase a single rumor. In the saga of Burnt and Jowl, dozens were slaughtered because one insult spread through the halls. Masculinity was currency, and to question it was to declare war. Women, too, understood the power of this code. The sagas describe wives who shattered their husbands' reputations in public, stripping them of authority by questioning their sexual adequacy. One woman divorced her husband in the Laxdæla saga by claiming he was too gentle in bed. With those words, she not only ended the marriage, she ruined his standing in the community. This was the Viking paradox. In a society where every man was expected to embody dominance, Everyone lived in fear of being exposed as weak. The result was a culture of constant performance. Every insult had to be avenged. Every act of violence doubled as proof of virility. Every conquest, in bed or in battle, became a test of manhood. The law of the axe was not written only on parchment. It was carved into flesh and memory. It turned intimacy into politics and slander into slaughter. In this world, to fall short in bed could mean losing more than pride. It could mean losing your life. The Vikings did not separate violence from ritual, nor sex from spectacle. What shocked outsiders most was how public their most intimate practices became. To the Norse, humiliation was not simply punishment. It was theater, a performance staged before families, tribes, and sometimes entire villages. Consider the Viking wedding. For us, it is a moment of privacy, perhaps sacred. For them, it was a legal contract sealed in front of witnesses, and intimacy itself was part of the performance. The bride's family often demanded to see proof of consummation, sometimes even listening at the door, waiting for sounds that confirmed the act. In some cases, trusted relatives were physically present in the room, observing. The next morning, the blood-stained sheets were displayed like trophies, serving as legal documents to validate the marriage. Love, desire, or choice meant nothing. What mattered was evidence. The bride's body transformed into property, her sexuality into a contract. But the stage of humiliation extended far beyond weddings. Punishment itself became entertainment. A criminal guilty of sexual crimes might not simply be executed, but publicly shamed in a way that mirrored his offense. A rapist could be forced to endure symbolic penetration before being killed, the crowd howling as justice was performed through irony. Adulterers might face castration in front of spectators who treated the process like sport. These were not hidden acts. They were rituals of power, teaching every man and woman the price of transgression. Even in war, humiliation was as important as victory. Captured kings were sometimes raped or mutilated in public, not out of lust, but as deliberate destruction of their social identity. To the Vikings, a defeated enemy stripped of masculinity became something less than human, a living reminder that domination was complete. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations of execution sites show bodies cut and stabbed in ways symbolizing sexual conquest, confirming that these humiliations were not mere legend but cultural law. The sagas describe festivals where captives were degraded before crowds. Bets were placed on how long victims could endure torment. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were organized spectacles, social theater designed to reinforce dominance, to remind every eye in the audience of the unbreakable hierarchy between conqueror and conquered. The power of humiliation lay in its permanence. A wound heals. A scar fades. But the memory of public disgrace lived forever, erasing honor from both body and soul. Viking society weaponized shame as efficiently as it wielded swords. For them, sex was never just pleasure. It was politics. It was property. And most of all, it was performance. A performance that bound entire communities together through shared cruelty, reminding everyone who held power, and who would never escape it. The Viking world was not random chaos. It was a carefully crafted system where sex, violence, and power fused into one. What Ibn Fadlan witnessed was not a strange aberration. It was the logical outcome of a culture that treated dominance as religion, humiliation as justice, and intimacy as war. At the heart of this system lay contradiction. Free Viking women held rights that would not be seen elsewhere in Europe for centuries. They could inherit land, divorce weak husbands, and even lead households or merchant fleets. Yet at the same time, enslaved women endured horrors that reduced them to objects of trade. The contrast was deliberate. By elevating the rights of a few, Viking society deepened the degradation of the many. Freedom meant power only because slavery meant despair. Even the gods were bound in this sexual hierarchy. Loki was mocked for taking on a woman's role, Odin questioned for practicing Seder, a magic tied to femininity. The divine itself reflected the same obsession with dominance and passivity. To be active was to hold honor, to be passive was to invite ruin. This was a cosmos where masculinity was sacred law and deviation meant disgrace. The legacy of these practices stretched far beyond Scandinavia. Viking raids spread fear across Europe not only because of their axes, but because of their reputation. Communities knew that to resist might mean not only death, but ritual violation, humiliation, or enslavement. The threat of sexual violence was a weapon of conquest, as powerful as fire or steel. Some towns surrendered without battle simply to avoid what they had heard of Viking cruelty. And yet, beneath the horror, there is something chillingly modern about their system. The obsession with dominance, the fear of humiliation, the use of sexuality as social control, these are not relics of the past. They echo in the laws, the stories, and the power structures that shaped Europe long after the Viking Age ended. Concepts of manhood, honor, and shame forged in those longhouses bled into medieval codes of chivalry, into patriarchal laws, into ideas of masculinity that still echo today. The Vikings believed that through ritual, domination could transcend death itself, that through humiliation, power could be eternal. Their fires burned bright 1,000 years ago, but their shadow remains. In the sagas, in the bones unearthed from graves, in the unspoken laws of modern gender and power, we still see the imprint of a people who fused intimacy and violence into a single weapon. When Ibn Fadlan turned away from that funeral pyre, he thought he was leaving behind a nightmare. But what he witnessed was not just history. It was a glimpse into how far humanity can go when power becomes obsession, and when domination becomes the only path to immortality.